Hi, we're going to read chapter 5 and maybe chapter 6 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when they were all in the room together, Lucy burst out, "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it as well. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in, and we met one another in the wood. Go on, Edmund. Tell them all about it." "What's all this about, Ed?" Peter asked. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in the story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right. But he hadn't made up his mind on what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing that he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy, and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending all about her story and her country in the wardrobe. But it's just for fun, of course. We're just pretending. There's nothing really there." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund was becoming a nastier person by the minute. Thought that he had scored a great success in upsetting Lucy. "Oh, there she goes again. What is the matter with her?" Edmund asked. "Look here," said Peter, turning to him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go on playing games with her about it and setting it off again? I believe you did it all out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," Edmund argued back. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter, "and that's the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or turning into some frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think it will do by jeering and nagging her about it each day?" I thought, Edmund stammered. "You didn't think anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that in school before now," Peter accused Edmund. "Oh, do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go find Lucy." It was not surprising when they found Lucy a good deal later. Everyone could see that she had been crying. "I don't care what you think," she said. "I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you'd like. But I know I met a fawn in the wardrobe, and I wish I'd stayed there because all of you are beast. You're just beast," she cried. It was a very unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he expected. And the two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the long passage, talking about it in whispers after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided that they would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He would write to Father if he thinks there's something really wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us," he added. So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, "Come in." He got up and found chairs for them, and said that he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting, till they had finished their entire story. After that, he said nothing for a very long time, and then he said something that neither of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," Susan began, and then stopped. Anyone could see from this old man's face that he was perfectly serious, but Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said that they were only pretending." "Well, that's the point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, Does your experience lead you to regard that your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which one is more truthful? The professor asked. Well, that's just a funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now, I would have said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear? Said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, Susan said, in general, I'd say the same as Peter. I would say Lucy is more reliable. But this can't be true. All about the wood and the fawn. Oh, well, that's more than I know, said the professor. And a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found to be truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed, he said. We were afraid that it might have even been lying, said Susan. We thought that there might be something wrong with Lucy, Susan said. Do you mean madness? Said the professor quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easy on that one. One has only to look and talk to her to know that she is not mad. But then, Susan said and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like that, like the professor did, and she didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor, half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she's mad, or she's telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she's not mad. For the moment, then, and unless any further evidence comes up, we must assume that she's telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and quite sure of the expression on his face, that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find the country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Asked the professor. Peter didn't quite know what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment that we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been gone for hours. Well, that is the very thing that makes her story likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in the house that leads to another world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know little about it. But if, I say, she got into another world, I should not be surprised at all that the other world has a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed in there, it would never take any of our time up. On the other hand, he added, I think many girls of her age would invent the idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming up and telling her story. Do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner, like that? Peter asked. Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach in these schools. But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off point. Ugh, my dear young lady, said the professor suddenly, looking up with a sharp expression at both of them. There is one plan which no one has yet suggested, which is all worth trying. What's that? Asked Susan. We might all try minding our own businesses, he said. And that was the end of the conversation. I like him. He's a good character. And that was the end of the conversation with the professor. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone felt inclined to talk more about the wardrobe. It all became a rather alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come here and ask permission to see it. It was the sort of house that was mentioned in guidebooks and even histories, and well might be for all manner of stories. And well, it might be for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the ones I'm telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission. And Miss Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor, the rare books in the library. And Miss McCarthy was not fond of children, and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors about things she knew. And she had said to Susan and Peter almost the first morning, "And please remember to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking the party around the house." "Just as if we would want to waste half the morning trailing around a crowd of strange grown-ups," said Edmund. And the other three thought the same. That was how the adventure began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at a suit of armor, wondering if they could take it to bits when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Hey, look! Here comes Mrs. Macready with the whole gang is with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all four made their way through the door at the far end of the room. But when they got into the green room and beyond it into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them, and realized that Mrs. Macready was just bringing her party of sightseers back up the stairs instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them to Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere until Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers." What does that mean? "Oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room until they've passed. No one will follow us there." But the moment that they heard the voices in the passage and someone fumbling at the door, they then saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter. "There's nowhere else." He flung the wardrobe open, and all four of them bundled inside and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but he did not shut it. For of course, he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never shut yourself in a wardrobe. Okay, I'm going to stop there for the day. Okay, so what's happened in the book so far? We're on chapter 5. We're on chapter 6. They have now all just stumbled into the wardrobe and into Narnia, and last time they all went in there, only Lucy was able to see it. And now I wonder if they're all going to be able to see it, and maybe they'll understand that Lucy has been telling the truth. Okay, I love this book. Alright, until the next chapter.